December 1944. The Philippine skies. A Japanese bomber pilot feels safe in the darkness. He's made this run 17 times before, always under cover of night, always invisible, always untouchable. His hands rest steady on the controls. Below, American positions sleep. Above, only stars. He doesn't know that 12,000 feet beneath him, a young American radar operator has just marked his exact position on a glowing green screen. He doesn't know that a massive black aircraft, something he's never seen, never heard of, is already climbing toward his altitude. He doesn't know that the rules of night combat just changed forever. In 4 minutes, his bomber will be torn apart by cannon fire he never saw coming. This isn't luck. This isn't coincidence. This is the moment American technology made the night itself a weapon, and Japanese pilots, who once owned the darkness, suddenly became prey in their own hunting ground. What happened in the Pacific night skies between 1944 and 1945 wasn't just a tactical shift. It was a complete psychological reversal that broke the confidence of Japan's most experienced aviators. And the Americans did it with a combination so effective, so unexpected, that even today, military historians call it one of WW2's most underappreciated game changers.
To understand why this mattered so much, you need to know what night combat actually meant in the Pacific theater before 1944. Night fighting wasn't some secondary concern, it was everything. Japanese forces had built their entire tactical doctrine around darkness. Their bombers attacked American positions at night, their supply convoys moved at night, their troop reinforcements landed at night. Why? Because American fighters dominated daylight completely. By mid-1944, Japan had lost so many experienced pilots that sending aircraft up during the day was basically signing death warrants. A 0 against a Hellcat in daylight? The statistics were brutal. American pilots were shooting down Japanese aircraft at ratios of 13-to-1, sometimes higher. So Japan adapted. They went nocturnal. And for months, it worked beautifully. American radar technology existed, sure, but it was clunky, unreliable, and mostly ship-based. American night fighters existed too, modified versions of day fighters with mediocre success rates. The real problem? Coordination. You could have radar operators seeing enemy aircraft, and you could have fighters in the air, but getting them together in three-dimensional space, in pitch darkness, at 300 miles per hour, nearly impossible. Japanese pilots knew this. They felt it. Every successful night mission reinforced the same lesson: darkness equals safety. One veteran Japanese pilot later described the feeling: "The night sky was our ocean. We swam through it freely, knowing the Americans were blind." But something was happening in the background that these pilots couldn't see. In California, in Florida, at secret facilities across the United States, engineers were solving a problem that would flip this entire equation. The P-61 Black Widow wasn't just another aircraft. It was the first American plane designed from the ground up, from the very first blueprint, as a night fighter. Not adapted, not modified, designed. And that distinction changed everything. Northrop Corporation started working on it in 1940, but the real breakthrough came from understanding what night combat actually required. Forget speed, forget maneuverability in the traditional sense. What you needed was a weapons platform that could carry heavy radar equipment, mount serious firepower, stay airborne for hours, and remain stable enough for a radar operator to actually do his job in the back seat. The Black Widow delivered all of this in a package that looked like something from a nightmare. Twin-boom design, 66-foot wingspan, 4 20mm cannons in a remote-controlled turret underneath the fuselage, plus 4 more mounted in the belly. But the real magic? The SCR-720 radar system. This wasn't some primitive detection device. This was a sophisticated airborne intercept radar that could track targets up to 5 miles away, and, this is crucial, it could give the pilot precise range, altitude, and bearing information. The radar operator sat behind the pilot in a dedicated position, reading the scope, calling out vectors, guiding the pilot onto the target like a hunter stalking prey through fog. Here's what made it revolutionary. Previous night fighters relied on ground controllers to guide them into the general vicinity of an enemy aircraft. Then the pilot would search visually, literally looking out the cockpit window, hoping to spot an exhaust flame or a silhouette against the stars. The Black Widow eliminated that entire guessing game. Its onboard radar meant the crew could track, intercept, and destroy a target without ever seeing it with their eyes. Now, imagine you're a Japanese pilot who's been told for months that Americans can't fight at night. You're cruising at 10,000 feet, engines throttled back for fuel economy, maybe eating a rice ball, maybe thinking about the supply depot you're about to bomb. You have no idea that an aircraft twice the size of yours is positioning itself 1,000 feet behind you, matching your speed, its radar operator calmly counting down the range. 1,200 yards, 1,000 yards, 800 yards. You never see the muzzle flash. You just cease to exist. But here's where the story gets even better, and where most people miss the real genius of what the Americans built. The P-61 was devastating, yes, but it wasn't operating alone. What Japan faced wasn't just a new aircraft, it was an integrated system of detection, communication, and interception that turned the entire Pacific theater into a monitored zone. Ground-based radar stations, SCR-270s, SCR-584s, were scattered across newly captured islands, each one sweeping the skies for hundreds of miles. These weren't the primitive early war radars that could barely tell a flock of birds from a bomber formation. These were sophisticated systems with experienced operators who'd been tracking aircraft for years. When a Japanese formation took off from, say, Rabaul or Clark Field, American radar picked them up within minutes of wheels up. Controllers would track the formation's heading, speed, altitude, building a complete picture of their approach. Then came the beautiful part. They'd vector P-61s into intercept positions, not randomly, not fly over there and see what happens. Precise, calculated intercepts based on real-time tracking data. The ground controller would radio the Black Widow crew. Bandit, bearing 270, Angels 8, speed 180, 12 miles. The P-61 crew would adjust their heading, climb or descend to the right altitude, accelerate to intercept speed. Once they got within range, the airborne radar took over, and the radar operator would guide the pilot through the final approach. Target at 11 o'clock, 4,000 yards, slightly high, turn left 5 degrees, descending, range 3,000, hold your course, range 2,000, target level, range 1,200, prepare to fire. This was choreography, this was precision, and for Japanese pilots who'd spent months feeling safe in darkness, this was utterly incomprehensible. There are documented cases, multiple cases, of Japanese crews reporting ghost attacks or claiming they were being hunted by aircraft they never saw. One Japanese flight officer wrote in his diary captured after the war, "We are no longer fighting American pilots. We are fighting American machines that see through darkness. I do not know how to defend against an enemy I cannot locate." That sense of helplessness, that's what broke Japanese night operations. Not just losses, psychological collapse. Let me give you a specific example that shows how brutal this new reality became. January 1945, Philippines. A P-61 crew, pilot Lieutenant Dale Haberman, radar operator Lieutenant Raymond Mooney, gets scrambled from Tacloban airfield. Ground radar has picked up a Japanese Betty bomber inbound, probably heading for American supply ships in Leyte Gulf. Standard interdiction mission. Haberman gets the Black Widow airborne, climbs to 12,000 feet, and starts his patrol pattern.
Mooney's watching his radar scope, seeing nothing but ground clutter and friendly aircraft markers. Then, at 23 miles out, a blip. Faint, but definite. Contact, 11 o'clock, 23 miles, slightly low, Mooney calls out. Haberman adjusts heading. They start the intercept. Here's the thing. This entire engagement happens over the course of 8 minutes, and the Japanese crew never knows the Americans are there until the last 5 seconds. Mooney guides Haberman through a series of course corrections, narrating the entire approach. 20 miles, 15 miles, target steady on course. 10 miles, we're overtaking. 8 miles, altitude matching. 5 miles, 4 miles. At 3,000 yards, Haberman finally picks up a visual, just a dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. The Betty bomber, completely unaware, maintaining steady course and speed. Haberman positions the Black Widow 800 yards behind and slightly below, the classic blind spot position that Japanese gunners can't cover. He activates the cannon system. 4 20mm cannons come to life. The firing sequence lasts 3 seconds. Haberman reports seeing pieces of the Betty's port engine cowling tear away, then a bright flash as fuel ignites. The bomber doesn't even try to maneuver. It just rolls left and enters a diving spiral, burning. Total time from radar contact to kill, 7 minutes, 40 seconds. Total time the Japanese crew knew they were under attack, maybe 5 seconds. Haberman and Mooney return to base, land, debrief, and are back in crew quarters before midnight. Routine. This happened dozens of times, but here's what makes it even more significant. The Japanese couldn't adapt. They tried everything. They flew lower, hoping to hide in ground clutter. American radar operators learned to distinguish targets from terrain. They flew higher, hoping to stay above American patrol altitudes. Black Widows just climbed higher. They varied their routes, changed their timing, flew in unpredictable patterns. Didn't matter. The radar net was too comprehensive. Some Japanese units tried radio silence, thinking maybe the Americans were homing in on their transmissions. Nope, radar doesn't care about your radio discipline. By spring 1945, Japanese night operations in areas with P-61 coverage had essentially ceased. Not reduced, ceased.
Now, let's talk about the people actually flying these missions, because the technology is only half the story. P-61 crews were a different breed from typical fighter pilots. Your standard fighter jock, think Mustang or Thunderbolt pilot, was often young, aggressive, individualistic, ego-driven in the best possible way for that job. But Black Widow crews? Different psychology entirely. For one thing, they operated as a team. Pilot and radar operator had to function as a single unit. The pilot couldn't see the target until the final approach. He was flying blind, trusting completely in his radar operator's calls. The radar operator couldn't fly the aircraft. He was entirely dependent on the pilot executing his instructions precisely. This required a level of trust and coordination that most fighter pilots never developed. There are interviews with P-61 crews where they describe the unique intimacy of night hunting. One radar operator, Lieutenant Edward Copsell, explained it. In daylight, a pilot sees the sky, the enemy, the battlefield. He makes decisions based on what his eyes tell him. At night, I was his eyes. He flew my voice. If I made a mistake, called a wrong vector, misread the scope, we'd lose the target or worse, fly into a mountain. If he didn't trust me enough to follow my instructions exactly, we'd never make an intercept. We became one person in 2 bodies. This created crews who stayed together for entire tours, which was unusual. Fighter pilots often flew with whoever was available. P-61 crews specifically requested to fly together, mission after mission, because they developed an almost telepathic working relationship. And the missions themselves? Psychologically intense in ways daylight combat wasn't. Imagine flying for 3 hours in total darkness, no visual references except your instruments. Engine noise, vibration, and the green glow of the radar scope. You're hunting another human being who has no idea you exist, stalking them through empty sky. One pilot described it as being a shark in deep water. You're the only predator, and your prey doesn't even know you're in the same ocean. But there's another aspect nobody talks about, the monotony between kills. P-61 crews would spend hours, sometimes entire nights, patrolling empty sky, seeing nothing on radar, finding no targets. Then, suddenly, a contact. The transition from boredom to lethal action happened in seconds. That kind of psychological whiplash affected crews differently than the sustained adrenaline of daylight dogfighting. Some crews loved it, others found it unbearable, the endless waiting punctuated by moments of extreme violence. Yet the kill ratios were extraordinary. P-61 crews in the Pacific achieved some of the highest success rates per mission of any American fighter type. Why? Because when they made contact, the engagement was almost always one-sided.
Let's flip the perspective entirely now and talk about what this looked like from the Japanese side, because their experience reveals just how psychologically devastating this technology gap became. Early war, Japanese naval aviation was among the best in the world. Their pilots had combat experience from China, their aircraft, particularly the Zero, were technologically competitive, and their night operations were sophisticated. By late 1944, all of that had collapsed, but the institutional memory remained. Veteran Japanese pilots who'd flown successful night missions in 1942 and 1943 suddenly found themselves in a completely different war. There's a fascinating declassified interrogation report of a Japanese Navy bomber pilot, Lieutenant Takahashi, captured in February 1945. He'd flown 34 night missions before being shot down. His testimony is chilling. He describes the progression of American capabilities as he experienced them. In 1943, we feared American fighters only during day. Night was ours. Sometimes we see searchlight, sometimes we hear anti-aircraft fire, but these are easy to avoid. Fly high, stay in clouds. American defenders are blind. In early 1944, sometimes fighter appears at night, but rare, and they cannot find us if we turn off lights and maintain discipline. By late 1944, everything changes. Now fighter appears from nowhere, no warning, no searchlight showing his approach. He is just there, behind you, firing. We try everything. We fly without formation lights, they find us. We fly low over water, they find us. We make irregular turns every 5 minutes. They find us. We stop using radio. They find us. One pilot in my unit says Americans must have spies on our airfield watching us take off. But this is impossible. They intercept us 100 kilometers from base, over open ocean, in complete darkness. How do they know where we are? What Takahashi couldn't comprehend, what no Japanese pilot at his level could comprehend, was that Americans weren't tracking them visually or through spies. They were being painted by electromagnetic radiation invisible to human senses, tracked by operators they'd never see, intercepted by aircraft whose existence they barely knew about. This created a profound psychological effect, learned helplessness. Japanese crews started assuming every night mission would be their last. That assumption became self-fulfilling because pilots who expect to die don't fly as precisely, don't navigate as carefully, don't maintain disciplined formations. There's evidence that some Japanese units began refusing night missions outright. In March 1945, a squadron commander at Clark Field reportedly had to threaten court-martial to get crews airborne after dark. The official Japanese naval aviation history, compiled after the war, includes a section on night operations with a stark assessment. By early 1945, American radar and night fighter capabilities had advanced to such degree that our night operations became suicide missions with negligible effectiveness. The psychological impact on surviving crews was severe and affected operational readiness across all aviation units.
Let's get into the specific technical matchup, because understanding exactly how outmatched Japanese aircraft were makes the whole situation even more stark. The primary Japanese bomber used for night missions was the Mitsubishi G4M, called Betty by Americans. On paper, it wasn't a terrible aircraft. Good range, about 2,600 miles with reduced payload. Decent speed for a bomber, around 265 miles per hour at altitude. Could carry a reasonable bomb load, up to 2,000 pounds. But it had fatal flaws that became catastrophic against P-61s. First, defensive armament. The Betty had 5 7.7mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon in the tail. Sounds okay until you realize the tail gunner's visibility at night was essentially zero. He'd be looking into complete darkness, trying to spot an attacker who approached from below and behind, a position where the tail gun couldn't depress far enough to engage anyway. Second, protection. The Betty was notoriously under-armored and had unprotected fuel tanks. American pilots called it the flying lighter because it ignited so easily. One good burst from 20mm cannons would almost always result in catastrophic fire. Third, speed and maneuverability. A Betty at combat load couldn't outrun a P-61, couldn't outturn it, couldn't outclimb it. In a fair fight, the Betty would lose. But these weren't fair fights, they were ambushes. Now look at the P-61's advantages. 4 20mm cannons firing 650 rounds per minute each. That's 2,600 rounds per minute of 20mm cannon fire. The kinetic energy and explosive force were devastating. A typical engagement might last 3 seconds of trigger time, resulting in 130 rounds hitting the target. Against a lightly armored bomber with unprotected fuel tanks, obliteration. The P-61 was also significantly faster, top speed around 370 miles per hour, meaning it could position itself anywhere it wanted relative to the target. Choose your angle of attack, maintain firing position, break off if needed. Plus, the Black Widow was genuinely tough. Armored cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant systems. It could absorb damage that would down a Betty and still make it home. But the real advantage was the radar-directed intercept capability. Let me walk you through a typical engagement sequence to show how clinical it became. Ground radar picks up target at 50+ miles. Japanese bomber has no idea it's been detected. Ground controller vectors P-61 to intercept course. Japanese bomber maintains straight and level flight, still unaware. P-61 reaches 25-mile range, airborne radar achieves contact, Japanese bomber first becomes theoretically detectable to P-61 crew, but still has no awareness of threat. Radar operator guides pilot through intercept geometry, closing from behind and below. Japanese tail gunner is staring into darkness, seeing nothing. At 1,000 yards, pilot achieves visual contact using radar-provided position data. Japanese crew still completely unaware. Pilot maneuvers to optimal firing position, 500 to 800 yards directly astern, slightly below. Japanese aircraft still flying straight, crew possibly relaxed, thinking they're safe. Pilot opens fire, first indication to Japanese crew that they're under attack is cannon shells tearing through their aircraft. It's over before they can react. Target destroyed, total engagement time from first radar contact to kill, typically 5 to 10 minutes. Total warning time for the Japanese crew, 2 to 5 seconds. This wasn't combat, this was execution.
Here's something that rarely gets mentioned but had huge implications. The success of P-61 night operations created an unexpected strategic problem for Japanese forces that went beyond just losing aircraft. When your night operations become impossible, you have only 2 choices: stop operating entirely or operate during the day when American fighter coverage is even more lethal. Japan chose a third option that revealed their desperation. They started using kamikaze tactics at night. Think about that for a second. The whole logic of kamikaze attacks was that a pilot willing to die could potentially get through defensive fire and guarantee a hit by simply crashing into the target. But that required seeing the target. At night, in 1945, with primitive Japanese instruments and no radar, finding a specific ship in the Pacific Ocean was extraordinarily difficult. Yet they tried it anyway because the alternatives were worse. This created bizarre situations where kamikaze pilots would circle their own bases for hours after dark, trying to build courage for a suicide mission, only to be intercepted by P-61s before they even left the vicinity of their own airfield. American pilots would sometimes report destroying aircraft that seemed to be flying in circles, making no attempt to evade, possibly disoriented or lost. One P-61 pilot, Captain James Bradford, described shooting down what he initially thought was a bomber, only to realize during debriefing, based on the flight characteristics and wreckage reports, that it was probably a kamikaze who'd gotten lost in darkness. Bradford later said, "I don't know if he even knew where he was going. We tracked him for 12 minutes and he just kept flying in a wide, slow circle. When we intercepted, there was no defensive fire, no evasion. It was almost sad." This raises uncomfortable questions about the end-stage Pacific War. How many Japanese pilots died simply getting lost in darkness, running out of fuel, crashing into the ocean, never even encountering the enemy? How many kamikaze volunteers spent their final hours confused and terrified, unable to find their targets before either being shot down or running out of fuel? The Black Widow operations contributed to this broader collapse of Japanese aviation effectiveness. It wasn't just the kills P-61 scored directly, it was the cumulative effect of denying Japan the night as an operational space. Supplies stopped moving, reinforcements stopped arriving, night reconnaissance became impossible, and this happened across the Pacific simultaneously. By April 1945, the U.S. had deployed P-61 squadrons to the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and throughout the Marianas. Every major operational zone had Black Widow coverage. Japan's Air Force was being hunted into extinction, and the night, their last refuge, had become a killing ground.
Let me tell you about one particular crew that exemplifies both the effectiveness and the strange psychological space these men operated in. First Lieutenant Paul Smith and radar operator First Lieutenant Robert Graham flew together for 7 months in the Philippines campaign. They scored 14 confirmed kills, an extraordinary record for night fighters. But their most famous mission wasn't their highest kill count. It was what happened on the night of March 3, 1945. They were on routine patrol east of Manila when ground control vectored them toward a large formation, at least 12 aircraft, probably bombers heading for American positions. Smith and Graham started the intercept, standard procedure. Close from behind, let Graham's radar sort out individual targets, engage them one by one. They got their first kill at 23:17 hours. Clean intercept, 3-second burst, bomber exploded. Standard. Second kill at 23:31. Same procedure. Clean. Third kill at 23:44. But here's where it gets interesting. As Smith was maneuvering for a fourth approach, Graham picked up something unusual on radar. One of the bombers had broken formation and was descending rapidly, almost like it was trying to land, but they were over open ocean, 40 miles from the nearest land. Graham called it out. Contact breaking left, descending through 8,000 feet, speed decreasing, looks like he's in trouble. Smith had a decision to make, continue engaging the main formation or investigate this anomaly. He chose to follow the descending aircraft. They tracked it down to 2,000 feet, then 1,000 feet, still descending. Graham's radar showed it leveling off at about 500 feet, dangerously low but steady. Smith got close enough for a visual and saw something he wasn't expecting. The bomber had its landing gear down, in the middle of the ocean, at night. Gear down usually meant surrender, but you can't surrender in the middle of the Pacific with nowhere to land. Smith circled, staying in visual range, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then he figured it out. The pilot was trying to ditch. He was setting up for a water landing in total darkness, and he'd lowered the gear because he was probably following the same checklist he'd use for a normal landing, muscle memory taking over in an emergency. Smith radioed ground control, reported the situation, asked for instructions. The answer came back, destroy if possible. Smith lined up behind the bomber. Easy shot, but he couldn't pull the trigger. Graham, watching the radar scope, said, "Paul, we have orders."
Smith replied, "I know. Give me a second." He followed the bomber for another minute, watching it maintain this impossibly low altitude, gear down, the pilot clearly fighting to keep it stable. Then the bomber's navigation lights came on, all of them, red, green, white, fully illuminated, in the middle of a combat zone. It was surrender. It had to be. But there was no procedure for accepting a surrender at sea, at night, with no possibility of the aircraft actually landing anywhere. Smith made his choice. He lit up the Black Widow's lights, pulled alongside the bomber, close enough that both crews could probably see each other, woggled his wings, the universal signal for "follow me," and turned toward the nearest American-held island with a runway, about 95 miles away. He was going to try to guide the Japanese bomber to a safe landing. Graham protested, "Command is going to have our asses for this." Smith, "Probably, but I'm not shooting down a guy who's trying to surrender." They flew together, American night fighter and Japanese bomber, both fully lit up through hostile airspace for 40 minutes. Smith later described it as the strangest experience of his life. The bomber crew never deviated, just followed his lead precisely. They made it within sight of the island. Smith could see the runway lights. He gestured for the bomber to proceed to land. The Japanese pilot understood, woggled his wings in acknowledgement, and began his approach. Then, at about 800 feet on final approach, the bomber's port engine failed completely. The aircraft yawed hard left, nose dropped, and it cartwheeled into the water just short of the runway. Smith and Graham circled, watching for survivors. They saw one life raft deploy, maybe 2 figures in the water. American crash boats were already heading out. Smith and Graham returned to base, filed their report, and waited for the reprimand they were sure was coming. Instead, they got called into the squadron commander's office. They expected punishment. What they got was commendation. The 2 Japanese crew members who survived gave intelligence officers detailed information about Japanese bomber tactics, radar awareness, they had none, and base locations that proved valuable for subsequent operations. The commander told Smith, "You made the right call, but don't make a habit of it." Smith and Graham went back to regular hunting the next night.
The cumulative strategic impact of night fighter operations isn't something you can quantify just by counting aircraft destroyed, though those numbers are impressive enough. P-61s in the Pacific scored over 127 confirmed kills, with a loss rate of less than 4%. But the real impact was operational paralysis. Let's look at what happened to Japanese logistics after effective night fighter coverage was established. Before P-61 deployment, Japanese supply convoys moved with relative freedom during night hours. Transport aircraft could fly reinforcements and critical supplies to forward bases under cover of darkness. Medical evacuation flights could operate. Command staff could travel between bases. After P-61 deployment, all of this became prohibitively dangerous. There's a captured Japanese logistics report from April 1945 that details the situation at Luzon airfields. It notes that supply deliveries had dropped to 23% of required levels because transport aircraft could no longer operate at night, and day operations resulted in unacceptable losses. The report concluded that maintaining air operations at current bases was strategically impossible without night supply capability. This had cascading effects. Fighter units couldn't get replacement aircraft or parts, bomber units couldn't get fuel or ordnance, personnel couldn't be rotated. The entire logistics chain seized up. And this wasn't just in the Philippines, it was happening wherever P-61s operated, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, throughout the island chains. There's also the psychological warfare aspect. Japanese commanders knew American night fighters existed, but they didn't fully understand the technical capabilities. This created paranoia. Some units believed American radar could track individual aircraft from hundreds of miles away. Not quite accurate, but not entirely wrong either. Some thought the Americans had infrared detection systems that could see heat signatures. They didn't, but the rumor persisted. Some believed there were spy networks reporting every takeoff, unnecessary when you have radar, but the suspicion damaged morale. The uncertainty was almost as damaging as the actual losses.
If you're a Japanese squadron commander trying to plan a night mission and you know that at some indeterminate point between your airfield and the target, American fighters might or might not intercept your formation, and you have no way to detect them until they're already firing, how do you plan that mission? How do you brief your crews? What defensive tactics do you recommend when none have worked? You can't. There is no good answer. So missions either didn't fly, or they flew with everyone involved essentially expecting to die. That's not a sustainable operational posture. By May 1945, Japanese air operations had been so degraded that American forces planning the invasion of Japan assumed air opposition would be minimal except for kamikazes. And even kamikaze effectiveness was declining because so many were being intercepted by radar-directed fighters before they reached their targets.
What's fascinating is how quickly this technology became standard and then obsolete. The P-61's operational career was incredibly brief. First combat deployment, mid-1944. War ends, August 1945. 14 months of frontline service. By 1947, most P-61s were being scrapped or sold off. Jets were coming online, radar technology was advancing exponentially, and the entire concept of specialized night fighters was already evolving into something different. But the principles established by P-61 operations, airborne radar intercept, ground-controlled approach, integrated detection and engagement systems, became foundational for modern air warfare. Every fighter aircraft today uses descendants of the technology first operationalized in the Black Widow. The AWAC system, Airborne Warning and Control System, is basically a sophisticated evolution of the ground control airborne intercept coordination that P-61 missions pioneered. Modern fighter radar, like the AN/APG-81 and the F-35, can track hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges over 100 miles. But the basic principle, use electromagnetic radiation to detect, track, and engage targets beyond visual range, that's the same principle that radar operators like Robert Graham were using over the Philippines in 1945. There's a direct technological lineage from the SCR-720 radar in a P-61 to the systems in modern air superiority fighters. What changed was processing power, display technology, range, and discrimination capability. The fundamental concept remained constant. And think about the tactical implications that carried forward. The idea that air combat could happen beyond visual range, that you could kill an enemy you'd never seen with your eyes, that was revolutionary in 1944. Now it's standard. Most modern air-to-air kills happen BVR, beyond visual range. Pilots fire missiles at targets their radar has identified, but that they've never visually acquired. The P-61 pioneered that approach. There's also an interesting economic angle. The Black Widow was expensive, about $180,000 per aircraft in 1945 dollars, roughly $2.7 million in today's money. For comparison, a P-51 Mustang cost about $51,000. The P-61 cost more than 3 times as much, but the kill ratio justified it. One P-61 could destroy targets that would require multiple conventional fighters to engage, and could do it in conditions where conventional fighters couldn't operate at all. This established a pattern that continues today. Yes, advanced systems are expensive, but if they provide capabilities that nothing else can match, the investment pays off. An F-22 Raptor costs around $150 million, staggeringly expensive, but it can accomplish missions that no other aircraft can accomplish. Same logic.
There's an aspect to this story that deserves examination, even though it's uncomfortable. The effectiveness of P-61 operations meant that Japanese aircrew were dying in situations where they had essentially no chance of survival or defense. Is that just effective warfare, or does it cross into something more troubling? During debriefings, some P-61 pilots expressed ambivalence about their missions. They'd describe engagements where Japanese bombers never fired a shot, never maneuvered defensively, just flew straight until they were destroyed.
One pilot compared it to shooting fish in a barrel and said he felt like an executioner rather than a fighter pilot. There's no glory in a completely one-sided kill. Others had no such qualms. Their view, we're at war, my job is to destroy enemy aircraft, Japanese pilots would kill me if they could, efficiency is the goal, not fairness. Both perspectives are valid. War isn't supposed to be fair, it's supposed to be won. From a strategic standpoint, American commanders wanted exactly this outcome, total air superiority achieved through technological advantage. From a human standpoint, it's harder to reconcile. There are accounts of P-61 crews watching bombers they'd hit spiral down in flames, seeing parachutes deploy, sometimes, knowing they'd just killed people who never knew they were in danger. Some crews were fine with it, some struggled. Post-war interviews reveal a range of responses. One radar operator, whose name was redacted in the declassified interview, described what he called target fixation guilt. He explained, "When you're tracking them on radar, they're just a blip on a scope, a glowing dot moving across a grid. You're doing geometry, calculating vectors, solving a three-dimensional puzzle. It's abstract. Then the pilot fires, and you see the explosion, and suddenly the blip isn't a blip anymore, it's an aircraft full of people who are burning to death. And you remember that you guided that process. You made it happen. Some nights I was fine with it. Some nights I wasn't." The Japanese crews obviously had no ambivalence. They were victims of a technological gap they couldn't bridge. There's tragedy in that. Young men sent on missions their commanders probably knew were suicidal, an aircraft that couldn't compete against an enemy they couldn't detect. But this raises the fundamental question about technological warfare. Is it better to have fair fights, where casualties are distributed more evenly, or is it better to have overwhelming advantage that minimizes your own losses, even if it means the enemy dies without a fighting chance? From a strategic perspective, the answer is obvious. From a moral perspective, it's more complex. The P-61 crews were doing their jobs with maximum effectiveness, which is exactly what their training and orders required. The Japanese crews were doing their jobs despite impossible odds, which is what their training and culture required. War creates these situations where both sides can be simultaneously right from their own perspectives, and yet the outcome is still hundreds of people dying in burning aircraft over dark water.
The final months of P-61 operations, from June through August 1945, represent an interesting evolution in tactics as Japanese forces became more desperate and more unpredictable. With conventional bombing operations essentially shut down, Japanese aircraft that did fly at night were increasingly kamikazes, or special mission flights, reconnaissance, command transport, that sort of thing. This changed the dynamic for P-61 crews. Instead of intercepting predictable bomber formations, they were hunting scattered, individual targets, often flying erratic courses. Some missions turned into marathon patrols, where a P-61 crew would stay airborne for 4 or 5 hours, covering hundreds of miles, making multiple intercepts across a single mission. The record for most kills in a single night by a P-61 crew is 5, achieved by a crew operating out of Iwo Jima in July 1945. 5 separate intercepts, 5 separate engagements, 5 confirmed kills, all in one 7-hour patrol. The physical and mental exhaustion must have been extraordinary. There were also increasingly frequent engagements where P-61s would intercept aircraft that were clearly trying to flee rather than attack. Japanese aircraft departing the Philippines or Okinawa, heading back toward Japan, often in damaged condition. The standing orders were to engage all hostile aircraft, so these were shot down as well. But the pilots knew what they were looking at, crews trying to escape, not fighters looking for battle. Some P-61 pilots requested clarification on rules of engagement for obviously retreating aircraft. The answer was always the same: if it's hostile and airborne, destroy it. This was total war in its purest form. The night operations in August 1945, right before the Japanese surrender, were surreal. Japanese air activity had dropped to almost nothing. P-61 crews would fly entire patrols, seeing nothing on radar, encountering no targets, landing without having fired a shot. Then the surrender came, and it was over. Pilots who'd been hunting Japanese aircraft for months suddenly had nothing to hunt. Several P-61 pilots later described the immediate post-war period as disorienting. They'd become so focused on the mission, so adapted to the rhythm of patrols and intercepts, that peacetime felt wrong. There was nothing to hunt anymore.
So what's the real story of the P-61 Black Widow and American night fighter operations in the Pacific? On one level, it's a straightforward story of technological superiority translating into battlefield dominance. Americans developed better radar, better aircraft, better coordination systems, and used them to devastating effect. Japanese forces couldn't adapt quickly enough and paid the price. But on another level, it's a story about the nature of modern warfare and the psychological dimensions of technological advantage. The Japanese pilots who flew into darkness thinking they were safe, only to be destroyed by an enemy they never saw, that's a metaphor for the broader Pacific War. Japan started the war with tactical advantages in several areas. By 1945, American industrial and technological capacity had erased all of those advantages and created new categories of superiority that Japan simply couldn't match. The P-61 operations represent a specific inflection point where the war transitioned from contested to predetermined. Once American forces achieved total air superiority, day and night, Japanese defeat became inevitable. The only question was how long it would take and how many more people would die before the conclusion everyone could see coming. There's also a lesson about innovation and adaptation. The Americans identified a specific vulnerability, Japanese reliance on night operations, and developed an integrated solution that didn't just address that vulnerability, but eliminated it entirely. That's the difference between incremental improvement and paradigm shift. Japan made incremental improvements to existing systems. America created entirely new systems. The result wasn't just American victory, it was Japanese helplessness. And perhaps most importantly, there's the human element. The pilots and radar operators who flew these missions were doing something unprecedented. They were pioneering a new form of aerial combat that would define air warfare for the next 80 years. They were also living with the psychological weight of extreme lethality, killing efficiently, clinically, often without the target ever knowing they were under attack. Some handled it fine, others didn't. War creates these situations where extraordinary technical achievements come with extraordinary human costs for both sides. The Americans who died in P-61 crashes or were shot down deserve remembrance. The Japanese air crews who died without ever seeing their attackers deserve acknowledgement. The civilians on the ground who died because supplies couldn't get through, because reinforcements never arrived, because the war lasted longer than it might have otherwise, they're part of this story too. Technology changes how wars are fought, but it doesn't change the fundamental truth that war is about killing people until one side gives up. The P-61 just made that process more efficient. Whether that's progress or tragedy depends on which side you are on. Either way, those night skies over the Pacific in 1944 and 1945 witnessed something that changed aerial warfare forever. Darkness stopped being a sanctuary and became a hunting ground. And once that changed, it never changed back.